Hello all and welcome to Answers from the Experts, Open Q&A. We really appreciate you being here tonight and we're excited to get things started. So let's start with the participating foundation staff as myself. I'm Holly Preeb, I'm the Chief Operating and Financial Officer, and Autumn Lintz is joining me. She is our Education Manager and she will be facilitating your questions today. Q&A available, yes, absolutely. That is why we are here. Please add your questions to the Q&A tool at any time. You can start right now, start populating them. And then as soon as we're done with our brief introduction, we will get started with answering those questions. This program is absolutely going to be recorded and you can visit the Foundation's YouTube channel in a few days and it will be available there for your viewing. We will also send it to any person who has registered in a link as part of a thank you follow-up email. We would like to thank our individual donors and our funding partners for making programs like this possible. We cannot do it without your donations and or without our funders. This is how we exist and this is how we are able to produce patient education forums, webinars, publications, and other materials, education materials for you. So thank you for your donations. Upon conclusion, we will be putting out, you will have a survey that pops up on your screen as you try to exit. We would appreciate you not Xing out of it, but actually taking the time to provide your feedback. We do use this feedback as a good tool for guiding future programs and making sure that we are meeting the needs of our community. So please take the time. It'll take just a couple of minutes, but please take the time to provide your feedback. We really do appreciate it. And then, of course, if you're not on it, please join our mailing list, visit our website for any educational information, join Community Connections for any peer-to-peer opportunities, and then always, as always, follow us on social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube to be up to date on anything that's going on here at the Foundation and when we have programs like this coming up. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the two speakers that we have joining us today. First is Dr. Basem William. He is a staff hematologist oncologist at OhioHealth. Dr. Williams is an active member of several professional associations and has been a PI, co-investigator, site PI on over 100 clinical trials in hematology malignancies and cell therapy. He's designed 10 investigator trials, published over 70 peer review articles, and over 100 peer review abstracts and 4 book chapters. Dr. William previously served on the NCCN guideline expert panel for T-cell lymphomas. Dr. William is certified in the American Board of Internal Medicine in hematology, oncology, internal medicine, and hospice palliative medicine. Dr. William is a highly accomplished clinician and researcher with a focus in cutaneous lymphoma and is also a very valuable member of the Foundation, providing his expertise across many of our programs and services. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William.
Thank you.
And next up is Dr. Stephen Daveluy. We are so fortunate to have him here with us as well today. He is an assistant professor, program director, clinical educator at Wayne State University School of Medicine Dermatology, also practicing at Karmanos Cancer Institute and the Veterans Hospital. His specialty is in dermatology. Dr. Daveluy is an active member of several professional associations, including Skin of Color Society, where he collaborates with experts across the country on research and educational initiatives. He has been published in many peer-reviewed publications and is the recipient of many awards. Dr. Daveluy is certified by the Board of Dermatology. Dr. Daveluy is a highly accomplished clinician and researcher with a focus in difficult skin diagnosis, including cutaneous lymphomas. He is also a very valuable member of the Foundation and has provided his expertise across many of our programs and services. Again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daveluy to this program. So without holding anyone up from having their questions answered, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to your questions. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Holly. I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question. I suffer from itch. It often keeps me up at night. Do you have any recommendations for soothing the itch?
So luckily, the itch in cutaneous lymphoma has actually been studied on its own because it's a little different than a lot of the itches we deal with. As a dermatologist, I see itch all day, from eczema to psoriasis to all kinds of skin diseases. But for some reason, the itch in cutaneous lymphoma seems to be a little different. So sometimes the things that work for the lymphoma also take care of the itch. So that might be topical creams like steroid creams or other creams, or light therapy where you go into this light booth and get treatments. But for some patients, they still have the itch even when other things are sort of working pretty well. So luckily, some really smart people have figured out some other things that you could talk to your doctor about. Some of them are medications that work on the nerves. So things like gabapentin can sometimes help, where it sort of calms down those nerves that are feeling the itch. Also naltrexone and naloxone, which are a couple medications that work on the opiate pathway, but they block parts of the opiate pathway. So you might have heard of naloxone as the Narcan, the thing that they use to save people having an overdose. So it can also block those itch pathways for some people. It can work. There's another medication called aprepitant, which is actually sort of a nausea medicine that we use sometimes with chemotherapy, and it's been shown to be helpful for some people. And then there's a couple others, like mirtazapine is another one that sort of works on the nervous system and helps out. The one that doesn't really seem to work well, and it doesn't really work well for a lot of itch, are things like Benadryl or the antihistamines. It doesn't seem like the histamine pathway is really involved in the itch. Some of the other things that you can do, like those were a lot of things that you need to talk to your doctor about. But some of the things you can do at home are oatmeal baths. So you can buy this oatmeal additive to add to your bath. And sometimes that can be sort of soothing and take care of the itch. And then bleach baths, which sound like a really scary thing, but it's just a little bit of diluted bleach. So it's almost like swimming pool chlorine bleach. And you put it into your bathtub, soak in there for 5 or 10 minutes, then you rinse off, put on a nice moisturizer. We used to think it really did a lot to kill bacteria on the skin, but the studies for that are a little bit mixed. We don't know, is it killing bacteria or does it just kind of have a soothing effect on the skin? So those are a few of the things for itch, but itch is a major problem with cutaneous lymphoma. So it is something good to make sure you bring up to your doctor. And if you want, there's an article, if you have a dermatologist who isn't as familiar with cutaneous lymphoma, there's an article called pruritus, which is the medical word for itch, pruritus in CTCL. And it's a great article that really reviews it and can kind of guide your doctor in finding it. I'll see, I wonder if I can even post it in the chat. Let me see if I can figure that out.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Daveluy. While you're looking for that, I'm going to go to the next question. I am stage 1A. Are there any lifestyle changes I could make that would improve my cutaneous lymphoma?
I can take that one too, because if people aren't too familiar with me being a dermatologist, I usually handle diagnosis and early treatment. So stage 1A, stage 1B, and then I am happy to collaborate with my oncologist colleagues to handle the more advanced stages where you might need more systemic or oral medications or even chemotherapies, IV medications, things for more advanced disease. So with stage 1A, some of the lifestyle things you can do are to avoid anything that sort of irritates the skin. So switch to sensitive skin soaps, laundry detergents that say free and clear and don't have a lot of dyes and perfumes. Make sure you are using a moisturizer. The best time is right when you get out of the shower or bath, because the water kind of strips away our natural oils and the soap does. So it's good to put a moisturizer on afterward. And then finding other times, moisturizer is another good, you can do it throughout the day too, because dry skin is a major driver for itch too. So it's a great idea to have a nice bland moisturizer that doesn't have a lot of perfumes and fragrances. Of course, eating healthy is always a great thing to do for any problem. Make sure you're drinking lots of water. And then CTCL, cutaneous lymphoma, can be really stressful. So it's important to recognize that it can have a mental impact on you, have a good support system if you can, which is one of the great things about the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation is you can talk to other people who have lymphoma. You can talk about things that have helped them out, make connections, really helps you to not feel alone in the world and to actually know someone else who's going through similar things. So I always refer people to the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation so that you can meet other people who have similar issues. For some people, meditating can help a little bit because it helps to deal with that stress, or having a counselor or someone you can talk to is always a good idea. So those are some of the lifestyle modifications that can be really helpful. Also, I will say too, the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation specifically addresses being intimate, because I think that's a hard thing for people with skin disease, is how to approach intimacy. And that's a very important part of our life. There were even some studies that showed if people had sex more, they were happier, which seems kind of obvious, but it's a nice human connection. So don't forget about intimacy and look for the resources on the website because they're super helpful.
I appreciate you calling that out. Dr. William, do you have anything to add to that?
I would add also that there is some role in sun exposure in controlling CTCL. So getting out of the house, doing outdoor activity. Be mindful though, sun is a double-edged sword. Little bit of sun you get, the bad for a lot of things, less vitamin D that gets into your body, less control of your CTCL. But the more sun you get, there is a risk of melanoma. So always make sure that you don't get a lot of more sun. If you have to use sun blockade to the areas not affected with CTCL, do that. But and certainly I agree 100% with Dr. Daveluy about the stress. We see that as clinicians all the time. Patients get they are in remission, they're doing great, then they go through a stressful event or a stressful time in their life, and their disease flares. This is something that I think is very understudied and deserves a lot of investigation. But as clinician, we see that all the time. So mind over body, relaxation, meditation, making sure to have a good support system, and try not to get isolated, connect with other patients. This is a challenge you see with any rare disease. You feel like, okay, I'm the only one in the world who has this. No, you don't. And that's where comes the role of the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation. Talk to other patients, share experiences. One thing I strongly advise not to do, this is kind of a strong sentiment, might be out of context here, but I don't want that the hour would pass, I didn't get an opportunity to say it. Do not go and look on Google. It's like sailing the uncharted sea. Never do that. If you desire advice outside the medical profession, talk to someone who knows. Talk to folks at the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation. Talk to other doctors. Obtain multiple opinions if you desire. Talk to different specialists. But do not go and sail the uncharted sea. You're going to read things that may not be applicable to you. It's an incredibly complex disease. Not two patients are the same.
Thank you so much for that. All right, we have some questions rolling in. I'm going to try and group them together the best I can. Can you tell me about lymphomatoid papulosis? Generally, how often are blood tests needed?
Oh, great question. We do blood tests for lymphomatoid papulosis pretty much out of tradition rather than science. So, if you end up being seen in a tertiary multidisciplinary academic place, we do blood work on you because that's what we do. If you're following with your community dermatologist, you might not need blood work. Generally, for most situation, lymphomatoid papulosis is a benign disease. However, few words of caution. It's a disease that unfortunately many medical professionals don't know a whole lot about. If you take a sample of a papule from lymphomatoid papulosis and to send it to a pathologist and don't tell him anything about the patient, the report will come back as peripheral T-cell lymphoma involving the skin. You read this and you say, oh gee, I'm doomed. Okay, and here comes the role of the multidisciplinary team, that the patient have seen a dermatologist who have expertise in cutaneous lymphoma, preferably if the dermatologist is also the same dermatopathologist and is able to put the pieces together, because under the microscope it looks very scary. And if you meet a clinician who's unfamiliar with that, you can be rerouted in a very scary direction that may not be necessary. It's a disease that's clinically behaving very benign, in a very benign way. It's not cancer, but under the microscope, it looks extremely scary for the untrained person. Most patients do very well. There is a small minority of patients where it starts making tumors, goes to lymph node, and behave in a cancer-like fashion. My advice to you about lymphomatoid papulosis, if you happen to live in a small town or a rural area, it's worthwhile your effort to travel to a center of expertise to see a clinician who understands this rare disease and get an opinion. And then you can be followed by your local dermatologist, but establish that connection to the center of excellence that in the future, should the disease change, you would have a point of reference to go back to.
Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question, why does this disease affect the eyes, nose, and feel like it is burning your face and your eyes and your nose?
That's a pretty good question. That's not something everybody experiences. A lot of times cutaneous lymphoma likes the areas that don't get a lot of sun. Because like Dr. Williams said earlier, the sun seems to help calm it down and get it to go out of the skin. So the face isn't a very common place for it. Having said that, it can show up anywhere. And, you know, the disease doesn't always read the textbook and know what it's supposed to look like. So sometimes it does what it wants to do. But it would be a good idea to bring that up with your doctors and preferably with your dermatologist, because it may even be something else going on. That's one of the challenges when you get a diagnosis of something like cutaneous lymphoma is then if you get a different rash, everyone kind of assumes it's your lymphoma still. But that actually sounds a lot like rosacea that might be going on your face, which can cause burning and stinging and affect the eyes and the skin. Right. So it can be a challenge, and it's good to have, like Dr. Williams was saying, have that expertise, because if people aren't really familiar with these rare diseases, it can be really hard to tell them apart. If it could still be the cutaneous lymphoma doing it, in which case it's sort of treating your face like the other areas of the skin and causing that itching and burning and dryness to it. But I would say make sure you bring that up with your doctor just to make sure that there's not something else going on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next question is a little bit of a longer one. My father was diagnosed in 2014. He has received 3 RT, but he hasn't recovered from the last one. The doctors decided to use Keytruda. He also has cirrhosis, and we are worried about the toxicity of this treatment. Have you used it to treat cutaneous lymphoma, and if so, how?
Great question. I haven't personally used Keytruda. The best data comes from the folks at the University of Stanford who led a big trial across the United States. And the results with Keytruda was kind of a bit disappointing to us as a medical community. We saw that we know that cutaneous T-cell lymphoma is a disease that's sort of immune related. It can be controlled by the immune system. We know that because one of the older medication we used to treat it with is interferon. And what interferon does, it uses the body's own immune system to clean the malignant cells from the skin. So we saw Keytruda, it works through the same mechanism by unleashing the immune system, would be that effective. But really the overall response rate in that trial was kind of disappointing. It's only 1 in 3 that have responded. We have expected that to be much, much higher. About cirrhosis, I don't know that I would be extremely concerned about that. There are treatment parameters that your doctor would follow. If it is what we call a compensated cirrhosis, meaning that the patient doesn't have water in their belly, ascites, if their just have a little bit of fibrous tissue in the liver, but liver seem to be functioning properly based on the blood test, it is probably safe to use. It's hard for me to give you a specific advice about your father without seeing everything, but there are many physicians within our CTCL community are starting to use Keytruda more, and they are reporting decent results. So now I should mention one more thing. There is some data that medication like Keytruda and radiation have a synergistic effect, means that if the patient have received radiation and then they receive the Keytruda after, it may work better. This is anecdotal. It had not been that studied. The idea is that you damage the tumor with the radiation and you release markers on the top of the tumor, what we call antigens, and that's how, and then you use the Keytruda to remove the brakes of the immune system. So it might work better after radiation, but this is all, this work is still kind of early. I don't know what you mean by not recover from the last radiation treatment, but I wouldn't be concerned about cirrhosis being an absolute contraindication for Keytruda if the cirrhosis is an early stage and the liver seem to be compensated, and your doctor can certainly answer that for you.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, I'm going to phrase the wording of what I think it is that the person has some injuries with necrosis. They did a biopsy 3 months ago and they're not healing. What creams could be used on those injuries?
Yeah, so it sounds like maybe it's injuries that involve the areas that have your cutaneous lymphoma, which can be a challenge. I mean, make sure your doctors are aware, because sometimes it's a sign the injury is not healing because the tissue has so much of the lymphocytes in there that it's making it hard. But sometimes it can actually be a sign that your disease may be changing. And those non-healing areas may actually be a sign that something has changed, and they might do a repeat biopsy, although it sounds like they did a recent biopsy. So we generally, as a general rule to healing areas, we say keep it moist and covered. So plain old petroleum jelly out of the jar is a great option. You put it on, you keep it covered, it keeps the air off, it helps things kind of heal up. But as I mentioned, if something's not healing, sometimes it means that the skin there isn't normal, or at least has enough disease that it's not allowing it to heal. So you want to bring that to your doctor's attention, because they may want to put a topical steroid on it. They may want to use a different topical medication. They may want to do radiation to those areas that aren't healing, which seems like it's only going to make things worse. But if it's the disease that's stopping it from healing, you have to stop the disease. But otherwise, the general wound care tips are to kind of keep it moist with something simple like petroleum jelly and covered. And then you have to be a little careful with things like topical antibiotics. Most people do fine with Neosporin or Polysporin, but it's not too uncommon to see someone become allergic to them. So then you're putting it on an area and it's not healing. It's getting more inflamed and more agitated. And it turns out it's almost like you're rubbing poison ivy on the wound every day. So we say keep it pretty simple. The bleach baths might be a good way too to kind of help, because they might reduce that bacterial load and help kind of calm it down and help it heal up. But I definitely say it's a good thing to bring it to your doctor's attention, because they may want to spend a little extra time on those areas that aren't healing and figure out what's going on.
Okay, thank you so much. There are two questions that are opposite ends of the weather, but I'm going to give you both questions so we can address them both at the same time. So we have one person saying that I have MF and noticed that the cold, windy weather makes the plaques become very irritated. What can I do other than moisturize? And then on the flip side, why does my CTL1A flare with sun and heat? I wear sunblock and need to keep my arms covered as they burn and itch horribly. If I'm in a hot, humid climate, my skin flares so much it takes up to 6 months after I return home to calm. And this particular person is on bexarotene pills.
Yeah, bexarotene. Yeah,
bexarotene. Thank you. So I don't know who wants to tackle. If you want to split the question.
I'll defer to Dr. Daveluy.
Yeah. I think maybe we can hook you guys up and you can just move to each other's houses.
Yeah.
So one goes to the cold, windy, and one goes to the hot.
Sounds good.
Humid. But the weather, it is a struggle. And I'm glad that those questions came in that way, because for every rule, there seems to be an exception. So like Dr. William mentioned earlier, generally sunlight helps cutaneous lymphoma and it clears it up. But every once in a while, we see someone where it agitates it and it flares it. And we see the same thing when we use it for psoriasis or eczema. Most people get better, but once in a while, there's someone who's sensitive to the sun and it sort of triggers it to be a little bit worse. I will say too, the bexarotene is in a class of medications called retinoids. Those can thin the upper layers of the skin, which allows sunlight to get through a little bit better. So we generally do recommend people be a little careful with them and wear their sunscreen and be careful, because it's easier for you to get a sunburn. Then the tricky thing with the sun and the heat and the humidity is, like you mentioned, the sweat. So sometimes sweating can sort of agitate it. And we don't know if it's just the sweat being on the skin sort of irritates it, if it causes the skin to break down a little bit. So one of the sort of obvious things that I'm sure you're already trying to do is avoid the heat when you can. So stay in the air conditioning when it's possible. If it's not, sometimes you can use like a moist towel on your neck if you have to be out in the heat, and that can kind of keep your temperature down and avoid sweating. The sunscreen's great. Shade is also really good. It's not so popular in North America, but in Asia, when it's sunny out, people carry umbrellas all the time, and it's your own little personal shade. And like I said, it makes you stick out a little bit, but I'll say even I do it, because us dermatologists, we tend to avoid the sun for the skin cancer risk. So I've been walking the dogs before on a hot day with an umbrella, and I think people probably think I'm crazy. And then I had someone come up and say, "Oh, you're really smart. You look much more comfortable than all the rest of us suffering in the sun." With the cool, it's kind of the opposite. You try to stay as warm as possible. Try to sort of keep areas covered up, especially if you find that wind is sort of a problem. One of the other things that people sometimes underestimate in the cold weather is the drop in humidity. So the outside air is really cold. Our heat runs in our houses, and that makes our house air really cold. So it can be helpful to have a humidifier in the house so that your skin's not getting so dry all winter. And I use the static electricity as my little barometer for myself. If I'm getting shocked every time I touch something, I know my house is too dry and I need more humidity in the air. And if I'm not getting shocked and static isn't everywhere, then I know there's enough humidity to kind of dampen it down. And then, like you said, using the moisturizers, layering clothing can be helpful. So that way, if it's cold and windy, you can sort of take off the outer layer, but still have something on. But yeah, the weather is a struggle. And then I'll put a plug in too for events like this and for other Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation events where you can connect with other patients who may have similar experiences and say, "Oh, I found this is really helpful," or "I found these particular kind of clothes are great for letting my skin breathe, but keeping the sun off of me," or being sunproof clothes that let it breathe a little bit better.
You're muted, Autumn.
Sorry, forgot I was muted. Going to stick kind of with the theme on light. We had two questions come through, and I'm going to put the two together. Someone was just asking if you find photopheresis effective. And then a question specifically touching on the bexarotene. Is it normal for phototherapy to bring out smaller patches on the skin initially? My husband had patches only in his hands and legs, started the therapy, and started having lots of tiny patches break out, which I believe you just said can happen with that medication.
Yeah. Photopheresis is a very good treatment. There are a few kind of general themes with it. One is best results are seen in patients who have what we call erythroderma, means that their whole skin is red and irritated, and they may or may not have circulating cells in their blood. These are the ones that seem to benefit most from this treatment, but it's beneficial across all stages, including the early stages. That's one thing. It doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and the problem is usually it's either clinician or patients or both are not very patient with that treatment. It takes up to 6 weeks to see a response. So once you start, don't abandon it so early if you're not seeing a treatment. Now, if you're a response. Now, if you're uncomfortable, there are more things that could be added to it to kind of provide the relief or to make it work better. Sometimes we add bexarotene to it, Tagratin. Sometimes we add interferon. Sometimes we add both of them, what we call triple therapy. One of the challenges I have seen in my experience is, and this is probably, I think in Europe, they tend to use that treatment better. Here, most of the photopheresis centers are not overseen by dermatologists or hematologists. They're more seen by our colleagues who manage the blood bank. And there is a little bit of a problem there because the way their workflow is, they like to put central lines in everybody. And when you put central line in a patient who have CTCL and broken skin barrier, that central line usually gets infected very quickly. And once that central line gets infected, the CTL gets worse, and the patient might get a bloodstream infection, get hospitalized, and they go through a nightmare. And then they say, I was doing well, I got started on this, and they make the mental association that it is the photopheresis that made them worse. Well, actually, it isn't. So my own inclination is, if the patient need to have a central line to have photopheresis, I probably don't necessarily want to do it. And I keep talking to my colleagues in blood bank and try to convince them, please do not put a central line in those patients. The session might take longer, it might be more challenging, the machine might clot and all of that, but always try to do it through a peripheral line. A central line in patients with CTCL is just a recipe for disasters. That have been my experience. The second question was about, light therapy and new papules. I'll let Dr. Daveluy comment on light therapy in particular because he knows way more than I do, but I just want to mention one theme. Once you start any treatment for CTCL, whether it is Tagratin, whether it's light, whether it is whatever, expect to see worsening before you see an improvement, what we call a flare reaction. Things might get worse for the first 2 weeks before they get better. And certainly keep communicating with your doctor because there are certain things he or she can do to make you comfortable. It could be a short course of steroids. Generally, we don't like to use a lot of steroids in that disease for long periods of time, but for short periods of time, they are okay. So if things get worse in the beginning, don't get discouraged. It's something to be expected, but there are some nuances about light therapy that I want to pass the question back to Dr. Daveluy because I think this is a very important question.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, Dr. William, because we see that not infrequently where it flares up a little at the beginning. And it's one of those tricky situations where if your doctor prepares you for it, you sort of expect it and you're ready to get through it. If not, you instantly think something's wrong and something's going bad and I'm flaring up and getting new areas. And sometimes I even tell people, I don't have good evidence to back it up, but I feel like that's a good sign. It means it's responding. Yeah. It's flaring up, but it's going to get better. Yeah, it means it's working in some way. And we see it with light. Sometimes with light, you get a flare up with just the itch. I've had a lot of people who I've had to kind of coach them through the beginning to get past the itching phase. Other people, they get to new areas that are kind of flaring up and involved with the CTCL. And then the other thing with the bexarotene is it can cause pretty dry skin. Mm-hmm. So I've had quite a few people who get like almost eczema when they're on it, like dry, itchy skin, which good luck telling your cutaneous lymphoma apart from eczema. They're both red and flaky and itchy. So they look almost identical. Luckily, the light can help both of them. The topical creams can usually help both of them. And this is kind of the season where that class of retinoids, it's tougher as we get into the winter months and it's drier skin. They make you dry and then you're extra dry. So do, again, bring it to your doctor's attention that you've got that itchy skin. But like Dr. Williams said, the flare up could be just sort of a part of getting there. I've even had some patients who the light booth, it gets kind of warm when you're in there because you're with a bunch of lights. So I had a similar patient who flared with sweating, and we couldn't do light therapy because he flared up too much from sweating in the light booth. Even with everything we tried, he would take a shower right before he came, so his hair was sopping wet. And we would try it that way, and we tried everything, cooling it down as much as we could. It just didn't work out for him. So we kind of had to move on to the next one, but do stick with it a little while, especially if you're miserable. Maybe it's not a great idea, but if it's a minor flare up, don't give up right away, because you might be able to work through that and get to the other side.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, are there any supplemental aids that can help with the immune system in regards to it attacking CTL, with attack the CTL?
Not that we know of. There is a lot of anecdotal experience with all kind of different things. One of the things that have had probably the most tradition is vitamin D. We frequently replace vitamin D in CTCL patient. We know that CTCL patient who have low vitamin D, their disease is more active. We know vitamin D is important for the functioning of the immune system in general. But we don't know if vitamin D is just a marker of other things. Like, I'll give you an example. If your skin is a little bit more dark colored, maybe you live in an area where there's a lot of sun. It doesn't mean that the dark skin is the cause of this problem. It could be the sun that's the cause of this problem. I don't know if you understand my analogy, but the point I'm trying to make is the low vitamin D is a more marker of a poor nutritional status, perhaps more sedentary life and less exposure to the sun. Maybe it's a marker of living in a heavily polluted city where you don't see a sun a lot, or you spend a lot of time indoor, or you're exposed to more stress because it's city life. So apart from vitamin D, there are not other things that I'm very aware of. And even vitamin D is fairly questionable at this point. I know, Dr. Daveluy, do you know of something else as far as supplements? And
No, not really well studied one. I will say it is a good point to let your doctor know any supplements you're taking, because there are some that can actually interfere with other medications.
Yeah.
Like one that people are kind of excited about is turmeric, and it can help with some things, and it might have some sort of cancer fighting properties, but you have to be careful because it can change the way certain chemotherapy treatments work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So make sure you bring it up to your doctor. And there's not a lot out there, so they may not be able to do much more than make sure that the ones you want to take are safe. But yeah, I totally agree with the vitamin D. I think it's a great idea to take it. A lot of us like I live in Detroit. You can't even get your vitamin D from the sun here because there's not enough sun throughout the year. So I tell people, just take vitamin D. And it's a good one. It's a good one to supplement because it's hard to get it if you're not supplementing it or getting enough through diet.
Thank you. So this next question is, a patient would like to know if they don't want to take any more treatments, and if radiation doesn't work anymore, what would be the end of the patient? Can you die from this disease?
It really depends on what stage the disease is. So generally, for radiation to have been done, we're probably dealing with tumors, although sometimes radiation could be done for extensive early stage patch plaque disease. You could certainly die from the disease, but the problem is it's usually unless it's more forming tumors and behaving like cancer, it's usually more breaks the skin, introduce infection in the bloodstream. It's not a, I hate to say it's not a very pleasant way to die, but as if there is a pleasant way to die anyway. But keep talking to your doctor because there is a lot of things that could be done to provide comfort, at the end of life. Treatment of itching is one of them. There are different newer modalities to provide radiation. There are newer treatments that are given to make radiation work better. There are phase 1 clinical trials always available. There are a lot of things that can be done. Now, if we're talking about just patches and plaques on the skin that are itchy, it is unlikely that that will cause death, but still need to be managed, because if the skin is very dry and it could be a source of infection, a person could die from something that's fairly treatable and fairly manageable, and that will not be that certainly will not be a good thing.
Yeah, and I'll say too, one of the things that is a challenge for us is sort of predicting who is going to do well and who is not going to do well. It's very hard to predict. The staging is really helpful, but sometimes there's people who start at an early stage and we don't know why they progress and they don't do so well. So it's kind of unpredictable. So like Dr. William had said, I'd say keep talking to your doctor about treatment options, because they may be able to find something that kind of helps and suits your needs and can be a benefit. Like if you haven't tried the extracorporeal photopheresis, it's somewhat similar to radiation. You go in, you get a treatment. It's pretty mild in terms of the side effects. Like that's and it doesn't have really, it's not a medication. So there's not a lot of interactions or other things to worry about. So that could be a good option. It's sometimes, depending where you live, it's hard to find a center that does it, but it's not too hard. And it might fit into the schedule because it's not something you're going to have to go in for, every day. So keep exploring options.
Thank you. This next question, you kind of just answered on it, but I wanted to see if either of you wanted to expand on it when you said it's hard to predict. The question is why do some go into remission and others do not?
Yeah, I think that's something that's super hard to predict. And we just really don't know. And honestly, it makes it even hard for us to compare treatments because the disease is so different. It's your cutaneous lymphoma and yours is probably not like many other people's, maybe not even like anyone else's. So it's really hard to tell someone how well we predict a medication will work for them, because some people, they work great and they have awesome responses, go into remission. Other people, it doesn't really work at all. And sometimes we have clues about what might help us. Sometimes if we look at the biopsy and there's certain cell markers on the surface, it tells us this one might work better or this one might work better. But other times it's a little bit of trial and error. And it's an interesting disease because a lot of times if you get something that works well and you're in remission for a while and then it comes back, you can circle back and do that treatment again, which is sort of interesting because you would almost think, well, it didn't really work because my disease came back. Well, it did work, just had a time limit and now we can do it. And sometimes it'll work again. But yeah, we don't really know why some people go into remissions and some don't. And I'll say there's some really amazing research going on where they are really getting to cells very, very well. And I think that's going to give us some more answers with time, where we're going to be able to really look at what is going on inside these T cells and predict a lot more. So stay tuned. Hopefully that'll come soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add, as you visit any of those big centers of expertise, if you're offered to participate in a registry where they collect your information and you give them blood sample, I would urge you very much to do so, because you're really providing an extremely valuable service to other fellow patients and human beings, because this is the only way we can make progress in this rare disease. Those registers are international, they're not only in the US, and we capture patients, we capture a lot of details, and those blood samples are all analyzed at the same time, and we're trying to learn to help other patients. So I would really urge you to when approached by any of the physicians you're going to see, I would urge you to participate in those kind of registry type studies.
So we actually have two questions that kind of spin off on this. The first one, and the we don't really know, is what causes this disease?
Oh, gee, yeah. I don't think we have any clue. There are some health conditions that seem to increase a person predisposition to develop that disease, but those are a minority. Those are single digit. Most of the other cases, they happen for just, no good reason. We don't really know. A while back, people have looked at viruses and tried to make association, but nobody really had come up with anything. Our best understanding is that think about it, T cells are the guardians of your body, of your immune system. They're supposed to respond to infection, to defend you. So if you keep irritating them all the time, not you on purpose, if a condition keep irritating them all the time, they're gonna throw in a mutiny. And there is some association between chronic infections of the skin, chronic pruritic condition of the skin, and sort of chronic inflammation. And that's why it's a nightmare for the pathologist sometimes to make a diagnosis, and patients get frustrated all the time because they say, hey, I got 3 or 4 biopsies before somebody could figure it out. The truth is, it's not like people didn't figure it out in the first 3 biopsies. The first 3 biopsies were a battle in transition. There was fight between your immune cells and whichever they're fighting against, an infection, an allergy, something. And there is a battle in progress. And at the end of that battle, those fighters kind of threw a mutiny and they became the problem. So the first 3 biopsies are what we call non-diagnostic. It means the pathologist look at it, the lab doctor, and say, I see inflammation, but I cannot make head and tail. And then finally, the process kind of unfolds. So I know it's kind of a long answer to your question, but short of chronic skin infection and how that, but that's only part of the answer, because there are many patients. Actually, most patients who get chronic skin infection do not go on to develop CTCL. So I know, Dr. Daveluy, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, that was great. That was really good. And yeah, it's tough. There's been a couple studies that have even tried to look at pollution in the environment and where people live to see if maybe there's an association, because we figure exposure to certain toxins might do it, but they've kind of had mixed results with that. And it's hard because, of course, people move too. You know, you might live somewhere for a while and then move somewhere else. And yeah, like you said, the biopsies, it's a challenge. I always tell people it's like a banana. I can tell you if a banana is green or if it's ripe or if it's brown, but there's a lot of steps in between there where if you said, is this a green banana? I'd say, I don't know, it's half green, half yellow. And so making the diagnosis is kind of like, well, I need to see a yellow banana. And you go, well, this one's almost yellow, I think. So it's tough. It's not an easy disease. And it's hard because like Dr. William mentioned, a lot of times people could have a different rash that then becomes cutaneous lymphoma. So then you drive yourself crazy thinking, well, when did it become lymphoma? How long have I had this lymphoma? And when was it the other rash? And it's kind of blurs the line. So I hope we can keep learning more about it and what goes wrong in the immune system to make it happen. But for now, it's kind of a mix. And luckily, it's much more rare in children, but even children get it. So then you go, all right, well, maybe that makes me think it's more of a genetic issue. If kids are getting it, they haven't been around that long to be exposed to as many things as adults have. But it's just kind of a mystery.
Yes, yeah.
Which a lot of diseases, we don't know why we get them. So
I think you both did a wonderful job of answering that very difficult question. Thank you. So we have a question about advances in treating disease by reversing epigenetic changes. Is there anything going on with that?
Oh, there is a lot that could be lumped under epigenetic changes. One of the oldest treatment that we have a pill called Zolenza that you might have received in the past, or there is an infusion called romidepsin. This works through epigenetic. So epigenetic means you have the DNA material that has the genes, and then on top of those could be modified by adding additional molecule with them, and that sort of makes the gene work or unwork. So you modify gene function, and this is not inherited. So epigenetic changes are not passed. It's just a genetic material. So those medications, either Zolenza as a pill or vorinostat or romidepsin, Istodax is a trade name, they work through that mechanism. So we had those medications for a very long time. There are newer treatments that work through other molecule inside the cell to turn on those epigenetic markers. There are what's called interfering RNAs, and there was some medication that have been in the market earlier, not in the market, there have been investigational, and we were very excited about, but the data sort of did not pan out as much as we hoped for. As far as other things in the line of gene therapy and introducing things through the cell by viruses and the like, I don't think we have made much progress in that regard outside things that are related to transplant and those kind of things. But it's difficult because, see, it's a rare disease, so there is little incentive to the industry to invest in it. Some did, and we really sort of appreciate and honor their valor in taking that risk, but many shied away. Throughout my career as an investigator, I have seen different promising things that are sort of were put on the back burner because not necessarily in CTCL in particular, but because it was seen that they are not very financially viable.
Thank you so much. Our next question: does CTCL commonly transform to Sezary?
Luckily, not commonly. So you always hate to be the rare person who has the rare version of the rare disease. But a lot of people who have CTCL, it sort of stays a rash. And that's sort of the tough conversation when I'm making the diagnosis with people who are early stages. I tell them, this is a cancer, but there's a really good chance that it's going to just act like a rash. And we're going to have to deal with it like we would eczema or psoriasis, which is great. But there is a small chance, sometimes it's around 10%, that it might turn into something more serious, like tumor stage or Sezary syndrome. So I want to make sure people sort of keep an eye out for it. But luckily, it's not a common thing. And it's not always a progression either. You can just go straight to Sezary syndrome, and it's almost a different population of T cells that are then sort of in the mix, because our T cells are little lymphocytes that are our T cells that, like Dr. Williams said, they're there to fight infections and parasites in the outside world. They kind of have different addresses where they live. So the ones that live in the skin tend to stay in the skin and go back to the lymph nodes and tell everybody what's happening in the skin, and then go back to the skin and fight any infections that show up. The ones that are in Sezary syndrome tend to be the blood ones. So they go and circulate through the blood. So they tend to be different, but sometimes one can turn into the other. But luckily, it's not a common event. So don't lose a ton of sleep worrying that it's going to happen to you. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. But luckily, it's not, I wouldn't call it common. It's the minority of patients who have Sezary syndrome, which is good.
Thank you. I want to give about a 5-minute warning right now. We have 4 questions left. So if anyone wants to hurry up and get them in, but we're down to the last 4 at this point. If you've used steroids topically for 6 years, can you have a bad reaction to overuse of steroids?
So I'll kind of answer quickly. Steroid overuse or steroid withdrawal syndrome is kind of controversial. Some people aren't really sure it exists, or does it just mean the steroids are working and when you stop them, your disease flares up? So it is safe to use steroids for your whole life, as long as you're using it on areas that have the disease and stopping when it gets better, or reducing it to 2 days a week when it's doing better. So dermatologists generally are good at telling you exactly how to use the steroids, when to stop, when to take a break to avoid any long-term issues. But there is a little bit of controversy over whether there could be sort of longer term side effects. But like I said, it's sort of a mixed bag. Some people aren't even sure that that's a real thing, or is it just that you have a disease that needs steroids, so when you stop it flares up? So talk to your dermatologist about it, but generally there are safe ways to use steroids your whole life. So there's not sort of a time limit on it.
Okay, thank you. I was diagnosed 2 years ago with MF in more advanced stage, and 1 year ago, FMF in biopsy on face and scalp. Treated with bexarotene for the first year, which worked well, but had a lot of side effects. Last 9 months, Intron-A, which worked well on a low dose, but it looks like Merck's discontinued it. They're moving to Pegasus, and they were asking if we know the successive transition to this form of interferon. Do you see what do you see as a success or side effects or long-term availability, which that might be harder to answer?
Yeah, we have more data with a shorter acting, the Intron-A compared to Pegasus, but there's data with the pegylated interferon. We believe they are comparable as far as efficacy. The side effect might be a little bit kind of different. So with the Pegasus, you might expect more effect on your blood count compared to the shorter acting interferon. The liver effect is probably equivalent between both agents. It's just we didn't have a lot of experience with it. We have used Intron all the time. This is what we're used with. But there were data, earlier trials that were done with pegylated interferon, and we believe they are equivalent. What likely will happen, patient will make that transition, and within the next 5 years will have accumulated enough data across our CTCL communities that we can go back and retrospectively look at. I can tell you from my experience as a clinician, which is probably more than your average hematologist or dermatologist. I think they are equivalent, but quite frankly, I haven't used a lot of Pegasus. I know Dr. Daveluy, that's an important question, because a lot of patients and a lot of clinicians are agonizing over the loss of Intron.
Yeah, and I haven't had a lot of experience seeing patients on Pegasus either yet. So I'm hopeful it'll be pretty similar and not too stressful. We always hate when people have to switch a medication for any reason other than it's not working.
Yeah.
Understood. We have one more question, and then we have a clarification on something that Dr. William had said. The question is, can the patches only fade with treatment, or can they clear away completely?
They can clear away completely. That's always our goal. I mean, sometimes the goal is get rid of the itch first, but we hope to have really clear skin. That's always our goal. We struggle to achieve it sometimes, but that's the goal, is to get it to basically totally clear up and be gone.
All right, so for Dr. William, when you were talking about the PICC line, oh, I just lost it. When you were talking about the PICC line for photopheresis, someone was asking for a little bit more clarification in regard to the central line. Is that a PICC line?
Okay, and very briefly, there are lines that are put in the neck or below the collarbone. These are generally referred to as central lines. They could be tunneled under the skin, and this way they can be kept, and they can be kept at home, and they're less likely to become infected. But that's not true for patients with extensive CTCL, because their skin is broken, and this is how the lines get infected. A PICC line, on the other hand, goes in the arm and goes threaded all the way through the arm veins until it reaches the right side of the heart internally, as similar to the lines in the neck or under the collarbone. Also, PICC lines are very notorious for getting infected. So they're not technically central lines, but they're also better avoided. I would say my bias, although I had not been always able to win that battle, or if you want to do photopheresis, use a peripheral line. Use just a big peripheral catheter, the one that you would just put in the arm or the hand that doesn't stay.
Wonderful. Wow, I am just blown away by this evening's Q&A. Thank you so very much. I think we actually made it through all of the questions, and it is 8 o'clock, right at the hour. Thank you so much, both Dr. William and Dr. Daveluy, for your time this evening. And thank you so much to all of the folks who brought your questions to the doctors. The foundation is here for you. Please reach out if we can do anything. And again, thank you so much to the doctors this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.